The question box. Does the olive and the martini break the Lenten fast, or is it considered part of the drink?
This problem has vexed some of the subtlest minds of the Church. Is the olive, qua olive, part of the martini, qua martini? Or is the olive a substance unto, of, and within itself, per se in the drink, rather than per accidens? And the question is further complicated by the fact that, if we consider the composition of liquid matter, an electron is but a tiny olive afloat in the martini of the water glass, so to speak. But here the last word, as usual, goes to St. Thomas, who remarks in his Summa contra omnes, Oliva quecumque est, cibus est, et certe eunium fragit. It must be pointed out here that St. Thomas had no mystical foreknowledge of the martini. He was merely listing those solids which are foods, as opposed to those which are not. It must also be said here, for the benefit of non-Catholic men who find themselves seated in bars next to a Catholic young lady during Lent, that the offer of an olive should not be construed as an attempt to establish an improper liaison.
What about the cookie that is sometimes served with a malted?
Let us not be silly.
Mrs. A.M. writes,
What should I do about all the broken statues, worn-out prayer books, old Catholic calendars, and fragments of rosary beads that I have lying around? I know I shouldn't burn them, and it doesn't seem right to bury them. Save them! A modern home has lots of room. If you want to repair any of the statues, use sacrosticky, a glue made from Lord's water.
Mrs. L.S.D. writes,
Exactly what do I get if I make the 5 First Fridays? My son says that you get hauled off to heaven by some saint or other. And finally, what, if anything, is in the last Fatima letter? In the first place, you have to make 9 First Fridays. You don't get anything for 5. In the second place, you seem to ask a lot of questions.
Mr. Arthur Dutch Wolahan writes, My kids keep pestering me for money to ransom pagan babies. Who are we ransoming them from? If they're pagan, I'm not sure I want them.
Babies are only pagan because of their parents. If they are still pagan when they reach the age of reason, they get wild and unruly. But we can save them and bring them up so they will be like Catholic children in this country.
Mrs. Annie Ruggs writes,
I've organized the biggest chain letter in the world. What are you going to do about it? I don't have to do anything about it. You are a contemptible little old lady who probably draws chalk pentacles to summon up guardian angels. With all the devotions that exist in the church, you have to pick one of the few that are universally condemned. And how do you know that your chain letter is the longest? Pride on top of superstition. Why don't you do some things useful, like keeping a day-to-day record of all your good and bad deeds? Then when you die, you'll have a rough idea of the state of your eternal ledger.
Mrs. Septa Tangeray writes,
My children and I are freezing to death this winter because my husband claims that in his syllabus of errors, Pius IX condemns the furnace as a modern invention. What can I do? P.S. We also grind our own grain for flour. Come now, you can't be too frozen if you're able to write this letter, which I see is a nice, firm, but feminine hand. Stop whining and face up to your duty as a wife and mother. You might try electric blankets, which Pius IX didn't know about, although some theologians claim that we are bound by what a pope is likely to have thought if he had lived long enough. See Father Bunty's book, Projected Thoughts of Popes. Anyways, good for you for grinding your own flour. If Anglican priest converts to Catholicism, are all the confessions he heard before his conversion invalid? They are invalid even if he doesn't convert. The poor Anglican sinner that this priest has absolved is, sadly enough, like a man who thinks he has filled a book with enough green stamps for an eternal reward. When, on the last day, he comes to the redemption center, God looks at the book and hands it back, saying with a frown, "These are not my stamps. Go somewhere else." Still clutching his worthless scrip, the bilked penitent falls headlong down the crystal stairs, bumping his head all the way to the bottom.
Miss Purina Sansfoy writes,
I was out walking the other day in Chicago when I saw a lot of men tramping down the middle of the street. Each one was carrying a bowling ball, and the bowling balls were attached to each other by a rope. I guess it was a rosary of some kind. The men who were the Our Fathers had foghorns and were bellowing through them. The rest of the men said something in response. Behind them all came an Irish bagpipe band and a couple of men carrying a banner that said, "Canonize Barry Fitzgerald." What do you suppose it all means? I don't know. I checked the Bible, and it definitely is not a sign that the end is coming. Have you thought that it might have all been a hallucination brought on by excessive piety or by incense? Too much incense in a crowded, damp church can produce odd effects, though since liturgical reform came in, incense poisoning has become a strictly Anglican disease. Perhaps you are an Anglican without knowing it.
Mrs. Gertie Frem of Adipros, Kentucky, writes, Is it true that matzo crackers are made with Christian blood? And is a schema on the Jews, or the Jewish schema, as my husband calls it, mean that I have to be nice to old Mr. Weintraub, who steals milk bottles off her back porch?
As for the first question, I would have to know the brand name. And to answer the second question, I would have to know Mr. Weintraub.
Benozzi Gazzoli of Tarentum, Pennsylvania, writes, I am 15, and every time I go to confession and confess unclean thoughts, the priest says, think of baseball. I don't like baseball, though I do like a hockey and pole vaulting. But I am afraid that if I object I will seem stiff-necked and unrepentant. And I did try to think of baseball, but it only made matters worse. Am I breaking the seal of confession by writing this letter?
Yes.
Sister M. Fiorello writes,
I teach a political science at St. Gertrude by the Tarn, and I want to use Marx's Communist Manifesto in a course. Not by itself, of course. I will use a lot of other things that prove Marx is wrong. Well, I asked the bishop for index permission, and he said, no. What do I do? I don't think your students will be any worse off for not being able to read The Perverted Twaddle, written by a satanic old man with a big bushy beard. Remember that the bad tree cannot bear good fruit. I used to teach a course in atheistic communism, and I always found that Bishop Sheen's book satisfied my needs.
And Min writes,
My mother-in-law is 89 and lives in the front hallway. Since she is the first thing our guests see when they come in the front door, we don't have many friends left, and they come around the back door. And she is always edging her rocker over to the foot of the staircase so that people can't get up or down the stairs. I would like to poison the old hag. Is there any way of doing it without violating the 5th commandment? Use the principle of double intent. 1, you do want her out of the way. And 2, you don't want to be guilty of murder. For this solution, you must thank the great casuist, Father B. Gormless, S.J., who discovered the principle of double intent in 1952. It is discussed at length in his book, Mental Reservations and Other Traps, Cumin Seed Press.
Father Bergabitz of St. Lentul's Abbey writes, The other day, when I was teaching a Redemptive Transmigration 1, a student asked me this question. Since Christ and the Blessed Virgin are in heaven bodily, And since body implies place, then heaven must be in some place. What if our spaceship fly into it by mistake? I have been ransacking the library and phoning observatories, but I can't find an answer. What do you say?
Your student's theology is correct, but he is lacking in the virtue of hope. If Flash Gordon, a fictional hero, can just shoot down spaceships, then God certainly can.
Mrs. Modine Clapp writes,
For 25 years now, my mother and I have had the same pew in St. Frungle's and Companions Church. Well, every Sunday this old rep, who married out of the church in 1920, comes and sits in front of us. When he tries to get up and go to the communion, my mother hooks her cane around his Adam's apple and chokes off his wind till he gets tired and gives up. Lately, he has tried sitting in other pews, but we followed him. Last week, he broke his collarbone, and so he's wearing a big high brace that my mother's cane won't fit around. Should we tunk him on the head? It would probably cause too much of a commotion. Most people who are tunked go, "Arr," and slump over forward, this attracting attention. Those who see all this but do not know the full story will condemn your action, though from what you have told me, the folks in your parish don't notice much. At the very least, they will think he has a heart attack, and what with all the doctors and ambulances and last rites, you will wish you had never started anything. I think you will find a little anonymous telephone harassment is worth a world of choking and clubbing. And you can get your old pew back. My name is Becky May Tipover, and I have seen a boy in my Catholic grade school going to a YMCA Christmas party. I turned him in to Sister Oza, and she give him a good bawling out, and I laughed and said, "Serves you right, Dopey. It says in the catechism that we should avoid occasions of sin." And he said, "You're a fink, I'll steal all the vigil lights in the church and roast you over a slow fire." I screamed, and the big sister, who was always bragging about her muscles, came and give it to him again. And now he sits behind me and whispers I can cut your throat with a ruler and not leave a trace. What should I do? My dear child, you acted rightly in the first place by heading off the boy's tendency towards wispy, wavery, watered-down Catholicism. Any punishment he metes out to you will be rained tenfold upon his head in the afterlife, not to mention what he will get in this life from the sister with the muscles. But I don't think he can cut your throat with a ruler, even one with a little metal edge on it, and in any case traces will be left. If he does murder you, emulate St. Maria Goretti by forgiving him, preferably with your last breath.
I.H. Samsonite writes,
My 18-year-old son, although he is going to a Catholic college, subscribes to the Catholic Worker, which comes to our house without even a plain brown wrapper. He goes to pacifist meetings and wears a button that says, "Dean Husk is made out of library paste." And last week I caught him trying to peel the "Get Out of the UN" sign off of the bumper of our car. He claims that the Pope endorsed the UN by his visit. Is that true? Of course not. If you read the right Catholic papers, and you might pass them on to your son, you will see letters and articles that prove conclusively that the Pope came to the UN to shake the secular nations out of their indifferentism, left-wing torpor. The UN was the only place where he could find the representatives of all those nations gathered together. As for your son's pacifism, the very idea of a Catholic pacifist is ridiculous. Look at the Crusades. Look at the Catholic France under Napoleon. Look at the abbot who was besieging an Albigensian town who had some Catholics in it. When asked who should be burned, he said, "Kill them all. God will take care of his own." Mention Catholic pacifism to any army officer, and he will laugh. Mention it to a Catholic mother whose son is in Vietnam, and she will hit you. Tell your son to form a devotion to some saint who was a soldier, and who, may I ask, is Dean Husk.